should be ashamed of who you are. You should be ashamed to be English. You should be ashamed to be male. Ashamed of your own importance. Guilty or privilege. All this nonsense. Whatever it is, we are in perhaps this Goldilocks zone of genius and thus low ethnocentrism, and this makes us more prone to these self-hating tendencies.
Why do some people prefer the out-group? Is that different from what we just discussed? Is there a reason for that? I'm not saying they're going to be traitors, but why do some people automatically look at other people, other groups, and go, I wish we were more like that. I wish we were them. I wish we could be like that.
Well, that's a number of different questions. I mean, you could prefer the out group. If you're saying about that, I wish we could be like that, then surely there's a degree to which people in poor countries must look at rich countries and think, I wish we could be like that. So in that sense, they prefer the out group. It could just be logical. They could say, hang on a minute, these people are more intelligent than us. These people are more pro-social than us. This is a higher trust society. These people produce more inventive and creative stuff. These people are just better people. And I wish my people could be like them. Although from a basic genetic evolutionary perspective, even if your people are rubbish, objectively by objective standards, you're probably going to prefer them and try and come up with copes. So, well, we may not be rich, but we were really brave, or something like that. So there's that element to it. But the other element to it, as I said, is if they are individualists, as we have covered, then it is adaptive to prefer a certain niche, for a certain psychology. It is adaptive to prefer the out group, because that allows you to obtain power over your in group. Now, then another element to this is that until really quite recently, really, I would say the turning point is 1963. We are a group-oriented society in which it is the group-oriented values that are promoted and that are instilled in people, and people are placed along an adaptive roadmap of life where they're inculcated with these group-oriented values and with adaptive ways of behaving. In about 1963, it seems to me, it flips over. About 20% of the population have been espousing individually oriented values, and it flips over because that tends to be a tipping point, about 20%. Once the up-and-coming group reaches 20%, they're seen as the up-and-coming group. They're seen as the Young Turks. People want to be on the right side of history, and so very quickly they get on board, and then you get this flip over into individually oriented values. And intelligent people are more socially conformist, so those people will tend to flip over most quickly. And once they do so, they're trying to gain status in the way that they used to competitively signal group orientation, and in particular sexual constancy. They now competitively signal being individually oriented, i.e. issues to do with equality and harm avoidance. And then you get runaway individualism, and then suddenly off we go. Then eventually you get to the point where I think we are now, where there's actually some evidence, I think, of a backlash against wokeness. But with the trans issue and DEI and self-hate and this idea that you should be guilty for being a man, guilty for being English, whatever, that you're inculcated, rather than the education system, for example, inculcating you with the idea that you should be proud to be English, you should be proud of the achievements of the English, you should be proud of who you are. No, you should be ashamed of who you are. You should be ashamed to be English, you should be ashamed to be male, ashamed of your own importance, guilty or privilege, all this nonsense. And so now, once that happens, of course, then it is beneficial to a certain degree to be a social conformist. So you can see that if hating the English, or at least hating the English is the in thing to do, then it is adaptive for a certain kind of person. For example, a person that's high in social anxiety, they will force themselves via effortful control to adopt that way of thinking and then competitively signal it. So it's adaptive. Well, that crosses over a little bit the neuroticism associated with individualism. But even people that aren't that anxious, that are just socially conformist and want to please people, are going to some extent be sucked into this psychological death cult. And I think that you were talking about Anglophobia and all this sort of thing. I think that we English are particularly prone to this. If we look at, well, why did this flip happen, this change? Throughout human history, we have been selecting for a number of traits concomitantly and therefore they have become pleiotripically related into what we might call a fitness factor. And they're all partly genetic, at least 50% genetic, sometimes more. In physical health, mental health, religiosity, conservatism, and intelligence. So that's a bit complicated because intelligence, although it's associated with fitness and health, is also associated with social conformity, which is why there's a weak correlation at the moment between intelligence and leftism. But that could flip back. That could revert. And in some countries, it is in the reverse. In right-wing countries, in conservative societies. So we have this fitness factor, and we have 50% child mortality. With the Industrial Revolution, child mortality collapses down to 1%. So obviously you get this build-up in mutation. And what's been found, and what direction will that be in? It will be in the direction of deviating from what we were selecting for under harsh Darwinian conditions, i.e. conservatism, physical fitness, mental fitness, and so on, religiosity. And so in general, what you find is that evidence of mutation is associated with mental illness, physical illness, whatever, for fitness, even having an old father, because having an old father is associated with de novo mutations, with a high mutational load. People that are left wing, on average, have older fathers. Anyway, so what all this means is that you have this built-in mutation, and that mutation will be in a left-wing direction. Eventually, then you get to a tipping point within the elite or whatever of mutated sort of people, and we tip over into what we have now, into clown world, into runaway individualism. Now, in England, the first point is that with the English, that process started first. We industrialized first. So you would expect the English to have more, to basically be more mutated. Secondly, the environment of England is harsh, cold, whatever, but not as cold as some places. Not as cold as Finland. Not as cold as Sweden. Not as cold as Norway. And so there might be a degree to which, but not as hot as Spain or whatever. So therefore, perhaps we have a slightly larger gene pool than those places, which means you're going to get more people with high mutational load, more people that are maladaptive, more people that are individualistic, more people that are self-hating. Thirdly, I think I've talked in a number of books about what I call a genius strategy. So there's a number of strategies for you to be the dominant group. There's the ethnocentric strategy, that you're high in positive and negative ethnocentrism. But there are other strategies. And one of this is the genius strategy. So let's say you have a slightly larger, somewhere like Finland, it has a higher average IQ than England, than Britain, but it produces relatively few per capita geniuses. Why? Because it's so harsh, the environment is so harsh, that you can't afford to deviate much from being absolutely adapted to it. So you have a small gene pool. How does genius happen? Well, it's high intelligence plus antisocial traits. Those things are generally negatively correlated, so it happens by genetic chance. If you have a smaller gene pool, there's less genetic chance. And the second reason is that they're so up against it. It's such a harsh environment. They can't afford to have criminals and deviants and people like that will undermine group cohesion. They can't. That's a killer for them. So they select that out, the psychopathy. But in selecting that out, they also select out the genius. So you don't get many per capita geniuses in places like Finland. You do in Britain. In fact, potentially the most of any country ever. So what's going on there then? Well, you could argue that we've adopted a slightly different strategy. Whereas the Finns are basically quite ethnocentric, and they were the last people in Western Europe anyway to flip over into multiculturalism, and they're highly conservative. The British have this slightly larger gene pool, and they produce, and this allows them to produce geniuses. The geniuses come up with brilliant inventions, and this allows the people to trade, and this allows people to grow and expand, and the gene pool gets bigger, and you get more geniuses and more inventions, and more geniuses and more inventions, and more geniuses and more inventions, and then you can dominate a group, many groups that are way higher in positive and negative ethnocentrism than you are, because of all your brilliant inventions that are a product of all your geniuses. So you become the dominant people. And as long as the level of ethnocentrism, which is low, doesn't drop too low, then you're fine. Now, the problem is our level of ethnocentrism has dropped too low. Now, why would that have happened? Well, we're in an evolutionary match, and our evolutionary match is 50% child mortality, being surrounded by death, being surrounded by people that are genetically similar to us, all these kinds of things. That brings out our instincts. And that brings out our moderate level of ethnocentrism, whereby we are quite ethnocentric, but we are also prepared to cooperate with foreigners and whatever, and follow this genius strategy accordingly. Put us in this evolutionary mismatch. Our instincts are not induced. And so our ethnocentrism is elevated at times of stress. It's elevated at times of mortality, is not induced. And so for a large portion of the population, the ethnocentrism drops perilously low, too low. And then if you add to this the fact that we're pro-social creatures as well, and we've got this runaway individualism, which is telling us to be anti-ethnocentric, to hate ourselves, then these things together help us to understand why we are like this. Whereas if you move slightly further north, the genius level is lower, the ethnocentrism level is higher. And if you move south, then they are ethnocentric to such a degree that they don't even produce full functioning United Nations. Italy is loads of different mini countries essentially. They're too ethnocentric to be able to cooperate enough to build up a large polity. Go further north, they're a bit less ethnocentric. Maybe than the Southerners, but they can build up a large polity. Other things as intelligence as well as other things that fit in. So, but we, as the Japanese, for example, highly intelligent. This makes them more cooperative and highly ethnocentric. But whatever that it is, we are in perhaps this Goldilocks zone of genius and thus low ethnocentrism, and this makes us more prone to these self-hating tendencies than, for example, the French.